Every story has a beginning, and the tale of the farm that raised 4 generations starts with a man who saw possibility in a patch of Iowa soil. In 1910, when the prairie still rolled unhindered to the horizon, the first generation arrived at a stretch of land near the confluence of 2 rivers. He was a son of immigrants who had fled political turmoil in Europe and sought peace in the open spaces of America. With a team of horses, a borrowed plow, and calloused hands, he carved furrows into virgin ground. There were no paved roads, no mechanized tractors, and no promise that crops would grow. Yet he believed that hard work and faith could transform a few acres into a legacy. The first season nearly broke him. The rains came late, the grasshoppers came early, and his young wife gave birth in a house with no electricity. He built fences from cottonwood trees and dug a well by hand, finding water 30 feet down. By the time winter arrived, the fields had yielded just enough corn and oats to feed a small herd and a fledgling family. Through blizzards and endless nights, he learned that resilience was not a quality you were born with, but something forged by necessity. He read the Farmer's Almanac by lantern light, studying the cycles of the moon and the changing of the seasons. He learned to plant beans to replenish soil and to rotate his crops to keep the land fertile. He understood that the land responded to care and that a farmer's stewardship was a sacred responsibility. In the spring, he built a barn with help from neighbors who understood that survival required cooperation. They raised rafters together and celebrated with communal meals. Each beam in that barn was a testament to community and trust, and its shadow would stretch across decades. The first year taught him that success on the land meant learning to adapt. When a drought scorched the early summer fields, he dug irrigation ditches by hand. When a storm flattened half his crops, he salvaged what he could and replanted. In doing so, he learned to read the weather, listen to the soil, and respect forces beyond his control. The homestead grew slowly at first. Livestock arrived one animal at a time. A pair of work horses pulled the plow, a few milk cows provided cream and cheese, and a small flock of chickens scratched in the yard. The family learned to preserve food in root cellars and to make soap from lye and fat. The children grew up sleeping under quilts sewn from flour sacks, their lullabies accompanied by the rustle of corn stalks in the wind. The farm was isolated, yet the family felt connected to something larger than themselves. A landscape that demanded respect, and a community that shared in both hardship and harvest. They watched as World War I raged overseas, and although they were far from the battlefields, the price of wheat and the availability of sugar reminded them that their work was part of a larger economy. When the 1920s brought prosperity, the family bought their first mechanical harvester, replacing hours of back-breaking labor with the rumble of an engine. They added acres and planted new varieties of corn and soybeans. Yet they maintained the old barn and the traditions that had carried them through the lean years. Their children attended a one-room schoolhouse, learned arithmetic from slate boards, and learned about life from the cycles of planting and harvest. They also learned that the land was not theirs alone, but was borrowed from future generations. The farm was not just a business, it was a way of life rooted in faith and family. Each Sunday, after tending animals, they gathered in the parlor to read scripture and give thanks. The values of integrity, work ethic, and stewardship were woven into conversations around the dinner table. In those early years, the farm gave as much to the family as they gave to it. The land provided not just food, but identity. They were farmers because they chose to be caretakers of the soil. As the children grew, they embraced the rhythm of farm life, rising before dawn to milk cows and collect eggs. They learned that perseverance meant milking during a blizzard and planting with blistered hands. They witnessed the first telephone arrive in the farmhouse and marveled at a radio that carried news from far beyond their county. Each new invention felt like a miracle, yet the core of their life remained grounded in the furrowed fields and the weathered barn. The first generation understood that building a legacy required patience and a willingness to plant trees whose shade they might never sit beneath. The farm's story during those early decades was also one of community resilience. When the influenza pandemic of 1918 swept through the state, neighbors took turns tending each other's livestock when illness struck. When a barn burned down across the ridge, it was rebuilt by the hands of those who had once raised ours. Weddings and funerals were community events that brought laughter and tears to the same fields that saw plows and harvesters. Through these experiences, the family learned that to prosper in rural America was to be part of a network of mutual reliance. They volunteered at the local church, served on the school board, and opened their home to travelers. Stories from those days became part of the lore that would be passed down for generations. Tales of huddling in the root cellar during a tornado, of chasing runaway pigs through a cornfield, of teaching children to read by the light of the same lantern used to check on a calving cow in the middle of the night. These stories were more than entertainment. They were lessons in humility and humor that helped them endure. Even the smallest successes, like coaxing an extra bushel from an acre or finally paying off a loan on a piece of equipment, were celebrated as victories. The first generation understood that progress on the farm was measured not just in bushels or dollars, but in the stability and unity of the family. By the end of the 1920s, the farm had survived its infancy. The fields stretched farther, the barn was filled with hay and laughter, and the children knew that they were part of something enduring. They could not yet imagine the trials the next decade would bring, but they had been prepared by hardship to face whatever came. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories of faith, hard work, and resilience interest you, consider subscribing for more. The Great Depression tested the mettle of every farmer in America, and the second generation came of age in its shadow. The early 1930s were cruel to the land. Prices for crops plummeted, credit dried up, and the soil itself seemed to rebel as dust storms swept across the plains. While Iowa did not suffer the full fury of the Dust Bowl, the farm felt the economic shock waves. The eldest son of the first generation was now in his 20s, ready to shoulder more responsibility. He had grown up watching his father coax life from the soil and had internalized the belief that perseverance would prevail. When corn prices fell below the cost of production, he and his siblings cut their expenses to the bone. They mended their own clothes, repaired broken machinery with salvage parts, and bartered with neighbors for goods. They planted gardens and raised hogs to feed the family when cash was scarce. Despite the hardship, they refused to relinquish their connection to the land. Instead of walking away, they diversified. They began to raise turkeys and sheep, learning new husbandry skills. They sold eggs and cream in town, sometimes trading them for flour or sugar. They dug a root cellar large enough to store potatoes and squash through the winter. Each innovation was a small act of defiance against economic despair. The second generation also witnessed the early introduction of government assistance to agriculture. Programs created through the New Deal offered loans and price supports that kept many farms afloat. The family attended community meetings to understand how new policies could help them. They learned to navigate paperwork, a new skill for people more accustomed to working with their hands. These programs offered a lifeline, but success still depended on the daily labor they invested in the land. They learned to terrace hillsides to prevent erosion, to plant windbreaks of trees to protect topsoil, and to practice crop rotation more rigorously. They adopted conservation techniques because they understood that depleted soil would not sustain future generations. In 1936, when drought returned, the family faced another crisis. Wells ran low, and the sun baked the earth into cracked clay. The second generation consulted with older neighbors and decided to drill a deeper well. It required pooling resources and a loan, but it provided water not only for their own fields, but for neighbors whose wells had dried up. This decision demonstrated their commitment to the community and the foresight that water security would be essential for survival. The well still serves the farm today, a physical reminder of resilience through foresight. During these years, the farmhouse also became a place of refuge for drifters and relatives who had lost their own farms. Beds were made up in the barn loft, and meals were stretched to feed extra mouths. The children watched as generosity flowed from parents who had little but still offered much. They learned that dignity was not measured by material wealth, but by the willingness to care for others despite your own lack. As the economy began to recover in the late 1930s, a new challenge emerged, the threat of war. In 1941, the United States entered World War II, and the farm's second generation was called upon to contribute. One son enlisted, leaving his wife and a young child behind to manage part of the farm in his absence. He wrote letters home describing distant shores and battlefields, and his absence was felt in the empty seat at the dinner table. Back home, the family took on his workload and participated in scrap metal drives and rationing. They planted victory gardens, conserved fuel, and followed wartime guidelines. The wartime demand for food and raw materials, however, also created market opportunities. Prices for crops and livestock began to rise as the government purchased food for soldiers. The farm balanced patriotism with practicality, maximizing production while adhering to rationing. They invested in additional acreage and purchased a used tractor from a neighbor who was leaving farming. This marked a shift from horsepower to mechanization. The tractor allowed them to plow more fields in less time, and the second generation marveled at how technology could transform labor. Yet they never forgot the wisdom of the horse, often relying on both when weather or terrain demanded. The children still learned to ride and harness the animals because the old ways provided resilience when the new ways failed. When the war ended, the late 1940s and early 1950s ushered in a period of optimism and change. The farm benefited from the post-war economic boom. With savings from wartime rationing and higher commodity prices, the family invested in new technologies. They purchased a second tractor and a hay baler, allowing them to harvest and store forage more efficiently. They expanded their herd of dairy cows and upgraded the milking parlor to handle more animals. They installed electricity in outbuildings, replacing lantern light with bulbs that flooded barns and sheds with illumination. They dug their first indoor plumbing system, providing running water to the house and milking parlor. These improvements reduced physical strain and increased productivity. The second generation found themselves able to produce more with less time, which allowed them to engage in community activities and church service. The 1950s also brought changes in agricultural markets and practices. Hybrid seed corn became widely available, promising higher yields and better disease resistance. The family debated the cost and benefits, but eventually planted hybrid seed on a portion of their acres. The results were impressive, with stronger stalks and fuller ears. Encouraged, they adopted the new seed widely. They also experimented with chemical fertilizers and herbicides that promised to simplify weed control. While these products increased yields, they also required careful handling and prompted discussions about long-term soil health. The family maintained a balance, using chemicals judiciously and continuing crop rotations and manure application. They built a new machine shed to house the expanding fleet of equipment. They also started a partnership with a neighbor to share a combine, splitting costs and scheduling harvest times. Cooperation remained a cornerstone of their success. Population growth and economic expansion led to more paved roads, new schools, and improved health care in rural areas. A new highway was constructed near the farm, reducing travel time to town and markets. This brought both convenience and change. Trucks replacing wagons meant larger volumes of grain could be hauled quickly. It also meant more traffic and the need for improved farm entrances and safety measures. The family adapted, installing wider gates and signage. They took driver safety courses and insisted that young drivers learn defensive techniques. The improved road also brought more visitors. Relatives from cities visited more often, marveling at the changes and reminiscing about childhood days on the farm. These visits reinforced family bonds and provided urban cousins with a taste of rural life. Education became increasingly important. The family encouraged children to finish high school and consider college. Some pursued degrees in agriculture, veterinary medicine, or home economics. Others studied engineering, teaching, or business. College education brought fresh ideas and sometimes led to off-farm careers. One daughter became a teacher and brought her skills back to the farm, organizing educational tours for school children. A son studied mechanical engineering and used his knowledge to improve equipment maintenance. Another child chose nursing and provided critical care when injuries occurred or livestock births were complicated. Education expanded horizons and diversified the skill set available to the farm. It also fostered connections beyond the local community, bringing in new perspectives and friendships. The 1960s and 1970s were decades of both progress and upheaval. Technological advances accelerated. The family purchased larger tractors, planters with multiple rows, and automated feeding systems. They installed bulk milk tanks that cooled milk rapidly, meeting new sanitary regulations and allowing them to sell directly to processors. They invested in artificial insemination to improve herd genetics, selecting bulls with traits that enhanced milk production and disease resistance. They built additional grain bins to store harvests until markets peaked. These investments required taking on more debt, leading to anxious nights and careful budgeting. The second generation was joined by the third, who brought energy and ideas, but also faced the realities of paying mortgages and loans. This period also saw social and political turmoil. The civil rights movement, Vietnam War protests, and cultural shifts swept across America. While the farm was geographically distant from many protests, the family felt the effects in subtle ways. Draft notices arrived for cousins and neighbors. News of battles and protests came through television broadcasts, now common in rural living rooms. College campuses where younger family members studied were centers of activism. Dinner table conversations expanded beyond weather and markets to include questions about justice, ethics, and global affairs. These discussions highlighted the farm's interconnectedness with national and global events. They also underscored that resilience was not only about weathering economic storms, but also about navigating social change. Environmental awareness grew in the late 1960s. The family watched news coverage of polluted rivers catching fire and oil spills fouling coastlines. They read books about pesticides and their potential harm. These stories resonated with their own observations of declining songbird populations and changes in insect life. They began experimenting with reduced chemical use, planting shelter belts and establishing wildlife habitats. They attended meetings with soil and water conservation districts to learn more. They adopted contour plowing and terraces on erosion-prone hillsides. They constructed grassed waterways to manage runoff. They planted buffer strips along streams, allowing grasses and flowers to filter water and provide wildlife habitat. These efforts reflected a growing understanding that long-term productivity was tied to ecological health. The third generation became passionate about conservation, bringing new energy to these practices. Economic volatility also returned. The 1970s oil crises led to soaring fuel prices, which increased the cost of operating machinery and transporting goods. Inflation eroded purchasing power, making equipment more expensive. Interest rates rose, making loans burdensome. The family managed by tightening budgets, delaying some purchases, and working longer hours. They diversified further, adding a small hog operation to capture profits from pork markets. They sold beef directly to customers, developing a reputation for quality. They began exploring niche markets, such as organic vegetables and free-range eggs, catering to a growing consumer interest in sustainable food. These ventures required marketing skills, label design, and customer interaction. The third generation learned to explain farming practices to consumers, building trust and loyalty. Adaptability continued to be a guiding principle. The 1980s brought the farm crisis, a perfect storm of falling commodity prices, rising interest rates, and mounting debt that forced many families off the land. The farm felt the pressure acutely. Loan payments exceeded income in some months. Equipment needed repairs that couldn't be postponed. Weather events added insult to injury. In 1983, a severe drought shrank corn ears and wilted soybean leaves. In 1985, a hailstorm destroyed a large portion of the wheat crop. The family gathered around the kitchen table to consider options. Selling the farm was unthinkable, but bankruptcy loomed. They reorganized their finances, negotiating with lenders to restructure debt. They sold non-essential equipment. They took off farm jobs to bring in steady income. One daughter took a job as a nurse in town, another as a bookkeeper, while a son drove a truck for a cooperative. These jobs provided cash to keep the farm afloat until markets improved. The sacrifices were painful, but the commitment to keeping the land in the family never wavered. Support from the community and innovations in farming practices helped them survive. Neighbors shared equipment and labor. Churches organized food pantries and financial assistance for struggling families. The family joined a farm support group where members shared advice and moral support. They learned about no-till farming, which reduced fuel use and preserved soil moisture. They adopted integrated pest management, scouting fields to target interventions rather than spraying prophylactically. They experimented with drought-tolerant crop varieties. They diversified further, raising sheep and goats to spread risk. They leased additional acreage to a young farmer in exchange for a share of the crop, helping a newcomer gain a foothold while bringing in some income. These strategies paid off gradually as commodity prices recovered and interest rates declined in the late 1980s. The farm emerged from the crisis, battered but intact. The crisis left lasting lessons. The family realized the dangers of over-leveraging and the importance of savings. They resolved to build a financial cushion during good years. They recognized that mental health was as vital as physical health. The stress of potential loss had weighed heavily on them, and they saw neighbors succumb to despair. They started talking openly about stress, seeking counseling when needed, and supporting each other emotionally. They learned that resilience was not just an individual trait, but a collective one, strengthened by community and shared experience. The children who lived through the crisis grew into adults with a deep appreciation for stability and a cautious approach to expansion. They also developed empathy for farmers who had lost their land, leading them to advocate for policies that provided safety nets and fair markets. Environmental stewardship became increasingly central as scientific understanding deepened and climate impacts intensified. The farm's soil was a living organism to be nurtured. Early on, the first generation noticed that planting the same crop year after year exhausted the soil. They responded by rotating crops and planting legumes to replenish nitrogen. By the time the fourth generation took the helm, soil health had become both a science and an art. They conducted annual soil tests for nutrient levels and organic matter. They learned that soil structure could be destroyed by excessive tillage and revived by cover crops. They planted winter rye, clover, and radishes after harvest, which protected soil from erosion, suppressed weeds, and added organic material. Earthworms returned, and the soil's ability to absorb water improved. They reduced runoff, which protected nearby rivers and streams. They also adjusted fertilizer applications based on test results and yield maps, reducing waste and preventing nutrient pollution. The farm implemented integrated livestock and crop systems that mirrored natural ecosystems. Cattle and sheep grazed on cover crops, converting plant material into manure that fertilized soil. Chickens followed, scratching through cow dung to eat fly larvae and spreading manure more evenly. Hogs rooted through leftover plant residue, incorporating it into the soil. This rotation mimicked natural cycles, reducing reliance on synthetic inputs and improving soil biology. They built movable fencing and portable water tanks to rotate animals frequently, preventing overgrazing and promoting plant regrowth. These practices were labor-intensive but aligned with the philosophy that the land was a partner rather than a machine. Water management also evolved. Early farmers relied on wells and rain barrels. Later generations installed ponds and irrigation systems. The fourth generation invested in precision irrigation that delivered water based on soil moisture data. They incorporated contour farming and grassed waterways to slow runoff. They restored wetlands in low-lying areas, which served as natural filters and wildlife habitat. They planted buffer strips along streams using native grasses and wildflowers to protect water quality and support pollinators. These efforts improved the farm's resilience to floods and droughts. Wildlife conservation became part of their ethic. They recognized that biodiversity improved ecosystem stability. They left patches of native prairie untouched, preserving rare plant species and providing habitat for birds and pollinators. They installed owl boxes and bat houses to control pests naturally. They monitored bird populations and worked with conservation groups to protect migratory species. They saw deer, foxes, and turkeys as part of the farm's community, rather than pests to be eliminated. They learned that a healthy ecosystem benefited agriculture by controlling pests and supporting pollination. They also shared these lessons with visitors, demonstrating that agriculture and conservation could coexist. Economic realities pushed the family to adapt creatively. The farm's income fluctuated with crop prices, and weather disasters could wipe out gains quickly. To stabilize finances, each generation added new enterprises. In the 1960s, they built grain storage bins so they could hold corn and soybeans until prices improved, instead of selling immediately after harvest. They pooled resources with neighbors to form cooperatives that negotiated better prices for inputs and products. They explored value-added options. The third generation invested in a small feed mill, allowing them to grind their own feed and sell mixes to neighbors. They began raising and finishing beef cattle, selling cuts directly to consumers. They created subscription meat boxes delivered to customers in nearby cities. This direct relationship with consumers provided better margins and stability. Diversification included experiences and education. By the 1990s, urban consumers became more interested in visiting farms. The family organized harvest festivals, pumpkin patches, and hay rides. They opened the barn to school tours where children could see cows and chickens and learn how food is produced. They hosted farm-to-table dinners that paired local chefs with their meat and produce. They offered corn maze adventures in the fall, drawing families to the countryside. These events generated income, but more importantly, they built relationships and humanized the farm for people disconnected from agriculture. They used these interactions to share their values, answer questions about practices, and dispel misconceptions. Managing financial risk also involved participating in government programs. They used crop insurance to protect against weather-related losses. They enrolled land in conservation programs that paid them to preserve wildlife habitat. They applied for grants to install renewable energy systems. They worked with agricultural extension to access low-interest loans for young farmers. They learned to navigate paperwork and compliance requirements, recognizing that these programs could provide stability. However, they never relied solely on government support. They saw it as a tool, not a crutch. They continued to build their own resilience through savings, diversification, and careful planning. The farm also navigated shifting markets. Globalization meant that a drought in South America or a trade dispute could affect prices for corn grown in Iowa. The family followed commodity news, studied trends, and learned to hedge risk through futures contracts. They also sought niche markets less influenced by global commodity swings. They grew food-grade soybeans for tofu production and heritage grains for artisanal bakeries. They experimented with hop production for local craft breweries. These ventures required research, marketing, and relationship building. Some failed, others succeeded enough to justify the effort. Each experiment taught them something about resilience and adaptability. Life on the farm is not without personal trials. Accidents occurred despite caution. One winter, a tractor slid on ice and pinned a family member against a barn wall, breaking ribs and forcing weeks of recovery. Another time, a young calf turned unexpectedly, injuring a hand. There were also sicknesses. A child developed pneumonia during a harsh winter, and the family took turns sitting by her bed, keeping the fire stoked and prayers constant. The closeness of farm life meant that joys and sorrows were shared intimately. When a calf was born healthy after a difficult labor, everyone celebrated. When a crop failed, everyone felt the loss. When a family member passed away, the funeral procession wound through fields they'd worked together, paying homage to a life anchored in soil. These experiences taught empathy and solidarity. They reinforced that the farm's greatest asset was the people who loved it and each other. Natural disasters left scars. In 1953, a tornado ripped across the county, toppling trees, flattening barns, and scattering animals. The family took shelter in the root cellar and emerged to devastation. Neighbors arrived with chainsaws and hammers, rebuilding what they could and salvaging what remained. The community effort not only restored structures, but also healed hearts. In 1993, floodwaters from a record-breaking rain event inundated low-lying pastures. Livestock had to be moved to higher ground in the dark. The family lost hay bales and a section of fence, but the animals were saved. They rebuilt, raising the barn floor and constructing levees around vulnerable areas. Each disaster reinforced the importance of preparation and the value of community support. They purchased insurance policies, built emergency kits, and developed plans for evacuating animals. They also deepened their spiritual practices, finding comfort in faith when confronted with forces beyond their control. There were also personal decisions that strained relationships. When one sibling decided to sell his share of the farm, others felt betrayed. Emotions ran high at the kitchen table, voices raised, tears shed. They eventually found resolution through open dialogue and mediation, but the episode left lingering sadness. Another time, a family member struggled with depression, overwhelmed by economic stress and physical demands. The family rallied around him, encouraging counseling and sharing tasks. They learned to talk openly about mental health, breaking a cultural stigma that often kept such topics hidden. They discovered that resilience included acknowledging vulnerability and seeking help. Triumphs balanced these trials. A state fair win for a prize steer brought pride. A record yield from a field managed with cover crops and no-till proved that sustainable practices could be profitable. A scholarship earned by a child allowed them to study abroad, broadening their horizon. A bank loan paid off marked freedom from debt. A wedding, celebrated in the old barn, brought laughter under twinkling lights strung between rafters. These milestones were reminders that life on the farm offered beauty and meaning beyond the daily grind. The juxtaposition of hardship and joy deepened the family's appreciation for each moment. They learned to savor coffee at dawn, to laugh around a fire after a long day of baling hay, to admire a field of wheat waving in the breeze. These simple pleasures sustained them. The bond between the family and the land transcended economics. The soil held memories. Each field had stories, a patch where a child's first tractor ride occurred, a hill where a marriage proposal was whispered, a grove of trees planted in memory of a grandmother. The barn walls bore marks from generations of horses chewing boards and children carving initials. The farmhouse kitchen table had grooves from decades of kneading bread and sorting mail. The wind that rustled through corn stalks carried the voices of ancestors who had prayed and laughed in the same space. The family understood that they were part of a continuum, custodians of a narrative that began long before their birth and would continue after their deaths. This bond manifested in their approach to land management. They refused offers from developers who saw the farm as a potential subdivision or industrial site. They placed portions of the farm under conservation easements, ensuring that future generations could not sell the land for non-agricultural use. They taught their children to value experiences and relationships over material wealth. When they discovered native prairie remnants on a corner of the property, they worked with biologists to restore and protect it. They learned that prairies host plants that take decades to reestablish, and that once plowed, they may never return. They saw their farm not just as production land, but as part of a broader ecosystem with intrinsic worth. The farm also served as a gathering place. Family reunions drew relatives from across the country. They camped in the pasture, cooked meals over open fires, and told stories late into the night. Children played hide and seek among hay bales, and elders reminisced about winters without electricity. The farm hosted community potlucks, church picnics, and charity events. Local bands played in the barn, and neighbors danced under the stars. These gatherings reinforced social bonds and reminded everyone that the farm belonged not only to the family, but also to the community that had supported it through good times and bad. Spirituality was interwoven with the landscape. Faith was expressed through stewardship, kindness, and gratitude. The family believed that each sunrise was a blessing and each harvest a gift. They planted trees as acts of hope, knowing that they might never enjoy their full shade. They placed stones at the edge of fields to mark answered prayers. They found solace in the quiet moments when only the sound was the whir of insects and the whisper of wind. Their spirituality sustained them when drought threatened or when the weight of responsibility felt heavy. It reminded them that they were part of something larger than themselves. Looking to the future, the family faced questions about how to continue a legacy in a rapidly changing world. Climate models predicted more extreme weather. Market volatility showed no signs of abating. Political debates over agricultural policy intensified. Rural populations declined as young people sought opportunities in urban areas. Amid these uncertainties, the fourth generation discussed how to adapt. They considered adopting more regenerative practices, such as agroforestry and holistic planned grazing, that would further enhance soil health and biodiversity. They explored carbon markets, which offered payments for practices that sequestered carbon in soil. They evaluated new crop varieties bred for resilience to heat and drought. They examined how artificial intelligence could optimize planting and harvesting schedules. They also grappled with how to maintain the family's values in a world that valued speed and convenience. One plan involved further diversifying into educational and hospitality ventures. They discussed converting part of the farmhouse into a bed and breakfast, offering city dwellers an authentic farm experience. Guests could participate in chores, learn about soil health, and enjoy meals cooked with farm products. This idea appealed because it generated income while fostering understanding of rural life. They also considered opening a farm school, partnering with universities to offer internships and field courses. This would allow students to learn hands-on skills and contribute to research projects on regenerative agriculture. These ventures required new skills in hospitality and education, but the fourth generation saw them as extensions of their existing community outreach. Technology continued to be both a challenge and an opportunity. The family debated the adoption of autonomous tractors that could plant and harvest with minimal human intervention. Some worried that reliance on automation could erode skills and disconnect them from the land. Others argued that technology could free them to focus on strategic planning, stewardship, and family life. They agreed to pilot a small-scale autonomous mower for maintaining grass waterways before making larger investments. They also continued exploring renewable energy, considering wind turbines and additional solar arrays. They studied battery storage systems that could allow the farm to operate off-grid during emergencies. They kept abreast of advances in gene editing and soil microbiome research, thinking about how these could improve resilience without compromising ethics. Community engagement remained central. They continued to host tours, write newsletters, and engage with policymakers. They mentored young farmers through apprenticeship programs, offering access to land and mentorship in exchange for labor and commitment to sustainable practices. They advocated for rural broadband, healthcare, and education, understanding that a thriving farm required a thriving community. They participated in farmers' markets and farm-to-school programs. They collaborated with chefs, breweries, and local businesses to create a regional food culture that valued quality and authenticity. They recognized that their farm was part of a network of farms across the country and that collective action could influence policy and consumer behavior. Estate planning and succession remained delicate topics. The fourth generation sought to avoid the conflicts that had arisen in the past. They consulted financial advisors and mediators to craft a plan that would allow some siblings to buy into the farm gradually, while ensuring that others received fair compensation. They established clear roles and expectations for those working on the farm. They emphasized that the farm's continued success required both business acumen and adherence to core values. They also considered forming a trust or cooperative structure that would protect the land for agricultural use, while giving each generation the flexibility to adapt. As they worked through these plans, they never lost sight of what had carried them this far. The fourth generation continued to attend church, share meals, and gather for nightly check-ins during busy seasons. They taught their children to ride tractors and also to turn off screens and watch the sunset. They reminded themselves that the farm's purpose was not just to produce commodities, but to nurture a way of life rooted in faith, family, perseverance, and the dignity of honest labor. They looked at photographs of the first generation standing in front of the original barn and felt gratitude. They understood that the 4 generations before them had endured wars, depressions, and droughts. Their own challenges were different, but the values guiding them were the same. Each decision about the future was made with reverence for the past and hope for the generations yet to come. As the farm entered its 2nd century, the family recognized that preserving their heritage required continuous learning. They attended workshops on soil microbiology and regenerative grazing. They read research papers on carbon sequestration and climate-resilient crops. They networked with farmers in other regions, comparing notes on what worked and what didn't. They invited extension agents and university researchers to conduct trials on their land, testing new practices. These collaborations expanded their knowledge and built relationships that benefited the broader agricultural community. The family adopted data analytics, using software to track yields, input costs, and weather patterns. They employed drones to monitor crop health and identify problem areas. They used satellite imagery to assess plant vigor and adjust fertilization accordingly. Technology became a tool for refining intuition, not replacing it. Education also extended to storytelling. The family felt compelled to share their experiences, successes, and failures. They wrote articles for local newspapers about soil health and animal welfare. They spoke at conferences and podcasts, explaining how regenerative practices improved resilience. They hosted farm tours for policymakers, showing them the realities of farming and the impacts of legislation. They welcomed journalists and filmmakers, offering transparent views of their operations. They understood that people outside agriculture often had misconceptions and that stories could bridge gaps. They embraced social media, posting photos and videos that showcased daily life on the farm. They responded to comments and questions with patience and clarity. By telling their story, they built trust and humanized farming for people far removed from rural life. The farm also became a place of healing and reflection. They partnered with veteran organizations to offer retreats for soldiers adjusting to civilian life. Veterans worked alongside family members, mending fences, tending gardens, and caring for animals. The rhythms of farm work provided structure and calm. They organized grief retreats for people who had lost loved ones, combining farm chores with counseling sessions. Participants found solace in feeding calves, harvesting vegetables, and sitting under the shade of old trees. The family discovered that the farm's tranquility and sense of purpose could help people heal. Offering these programs honored their values of faith and service while diversifying farm income modestly. As technological, social, and economic changes continued, the farm leaned into resilience through flexibility. The family adapted to a pandemic that disrupted supply chains and closed restaurants by shifting more sales directly to consumers. They offered delivery services and contactless pickup options for meat and produce. They navigated new health regulations and found creative ways to engage with customers online through virtual farm tours and cooking demonstrations. They learned that adaptability was not just about crops and weather, but also about public health and consumer behavior. They established relationships with local food banks, donating surplus produce and meat to support community members facing food insecurity. They collaborated with nearby farms to coordinate planting and harvest to avoid oversupply and waste. They also explored new opportunities in ecosystem services. Carbon markets, once theoretical, began offering payments to farmers who could document practices that sequestered carbon. The family compiled records of cover cropping, reduced tillage, and rotational grazing. They worked with verifiers to quantify carbon stored in soil and applied for credits. These revenue streams were modest but symbolically important, affirming that stewardship had tangible value. They also joined pollinator habitat programs that compensated them for planting and maintaining wildflower strips. They installed solar panels on barn roofs and replaced diesel engines with electric models where feasible. These changes reduced emissions and operating costs. Maintaining personal connections remained crucial. Even as they expanded their online presence, the family continued to attend church, school events, and community meetings. They hosted potlucks when it was safe, gathering under the old barn's beams to share food and stories. They visited neighbors to check on health and offer help. They wrote handwritten letters to elders who couldn't use the internet. They sat on front porches and watched sunsets, reminding themselves that the pace of life didn't always need to match the speed of their internet connection. They understood that technology should serve relationships rather than replace them. As the sun sets on the fourth generation stewardship and rises on the fifth, the story continues. The children of the fourth generation are learning to read the land, to appreciate the scent of freshly turned earth, and to understand the weight of carrying a legacy. They will face challenges unforeseen by their ancestors, new pests, changing climates, evolving markets, and social transformations. They will also inherit a farm that has been shaped by a century of love, hardship, and innovation. They will walk among trees planted by great-grandparents and harvest from fields cared for by ancestors they never met. They will hear stories of the barn raising in 1910, the drought of 1936, the price crash of the 1980s, and the flood of 1993, and they will add their own chapters. The farm's future will depend on their willingness to listen to the past and imagine new possibilities. It will require them to embrace technology and tradition, to prioritize soil health and financial viability, to respect individual aspirations and collective goals. It will challenge them to maintain the balance between productivity and regeneration. It will test their commitment to community and faith. It will ask them to make decisions that honor the sacrifices of those who came before while charting a path forward that ensures the farm remains a place where children can grow into resilient adults. To truly understand the fabric of a farm that endures across generations, one must examine the pattern of a single year. A year on the farm is a tapestry of seasons woven together by daily tasks that are both mundane and miraculous. It begins in late winter when frost still clings to fence posts and breath hangs in the morning air. At this time of year, the family gathers around the kitchen table, not for meals, but for planning. Seed catalogs are spread out like a deck of cards, each page promising yields and flavor profiles. Decisions about which corn hybrids to plant, how many acres of soybeans to sow, and whether to experiment with a new cover crop are debated. Soil test results from the previous fall guide fertilizer plans. The order of tasks is set, but the calendar remains flexible, knowing that weather will write its own script. In the barn, calving and lambing season begins. Sleepless nights become routine as family members check expectant cows and ewes every few hours. New calf born in the pre-dawn darkness needs assistance standing, and its arrival is celebrated with relief and joy. These births serve as reminders that life renews itself even in the coldest months. When the first thaw arrives, preparations move outdoors. Machinery that has been serviced in the heated shed over winter is rolled out and tested. Planter units are calibrated to ensure seeds are placed at precise depths and intervals. The smell of grease and diesel fills the air. Fencing is inspected. Broken posts from winter storms are replaced. Waterers in the pastures are checked for leaks. The maple trees begin to bud, and the family knows that mud season has arrived. Hauling manure from winter bedding to spread on fields becomes a daily chore, turning waste into nutrient-rich fertilizer. The fields are still too wet to support tractors, so patience is required. In these weeks, attention turns to cleaning up branches, burning brush, and repairing equipment. The greenhouse, set up a few years ago to start transplants early, comes to life. Trays of seedlings sprout, promising tomatoes, peppers, and herbs for the farm garden and local markets. Planting begins when the soil warms and dries, often in late April or early May. It is a time of urgency and hope. Tractors pull planters through fields from dawn until well after dusk, their lights glowing like fireflies under the stars. Each pass of the planter places seeds into furrows that have been fertilized and prepared. The precision of GPS guidance ensures that rows are straight and spacing is consistent. In the cab, a member of the fourth generation monitors, adjusting planting depth and population rates on the fly. Communication across the farm relies on two-way radios and mobile apps, with one operator refilling seed hoppers and another hauling fertilizer. Meals are brought to fields by family members who cannot operate machinery, allowing planting to continue uninterrupted. Rain delays are both a frustration and a relief. They slow progress, but also provide moisture essential for germination. During these pauses, the family checks fences, fixes tiles, and tends to livestock. As crops emerge, the family carefully monitors weeds and pests. Targeted herbicides, rotational grazing, and early mowing sustain healthy pastures and orchards. Summer arrives with heat and storms. Corn pushes skyward, its leaves rustling in the wind. Soybeans set flowers. Wheat turns golden. The air smells of sweet clover and cut hay. The family cuts alfalfa, baling it into large round bales that will feed cattle through winter. They rake and bale in a dance with the weather, watching radar to avoid rain that could spoil the cut hay. They haul bales from fields to barns, stacking them high in the hayloft. Days are long, and sleep is scarce. Thunderheads build on the horizon. Lightning can ignite fields or barns, so the family installs lightning rods and monitors weather alerts. When storms approach, they race to secure equipment and animals. After a storm passes, they assess damage and repair fences knocked down by falling branches. By midsummer, the family harvests vegetables and sweet corn, enjoys evening hay rides, and shares in county fairs where young members show animals and celebrate rural life. As summer wanes, wheat harvest begins. Combines move through fields, their heads cutting the grain and separating kernels from chaff. Dust clouds rise. Grain flows into wagons that deliver it to storage bins or local elevators. The rhythmic hum of the combine is punctuated by the occasional clog or breakdown. Repairs are made on the fly. The family starts preparing machinery for corn and soybean harvest, greasing bearings and replacing worn parts. They calibrate yield monitors that will provide data for yield maps used to fine-tune future inputs. Gardens are canned and preserved, their bounty stored in mason jars lined up in the basement. A sense of urgency returns as they realize that the longest days of light are behind them and that harvest, school, and cooler weather are approaching. Early autumn is the crescendo. Corn harvest begins when the moisture content drops to a level safe for storage. Combines cut rows of corn, separating kernels from cobs. Grain augers fill bins. Semi-trucks haul grain to ethanol plants or elevators. Dust coats everything. Soybean harvest follows. The combines slicing through golden fields. Long days stretch into nights as headlamps cut across the field. Meals are eaten on the go. The family monitors moisture levels, adjusts concave settings, and repairs broken belts. They also keep watch for deer, raccoons, and other wildlife drawn to harvested fields. In between harvest tasks, they plant cover crops to protect soil through winter. They broadcast rye or oats behind the combine, using the last warmth of autumn to germinate seeds. They apply manure to harvested fields, recycling nutrients and building organic matter. During this time, school continues for younger children who balance homework with chores. The elderly offer support by cooking, babysitting, and running errands. The entire extended family is involved in some way, ensuring that the farm functions like a well-practiced orchestra. When the last loads of corn and soybeans are hauled away, a profound exhaustion sets in, accompanied by gratitude. Winter preparations begin anew. Machinery is cleaned and stored. Grain bins are checked for spoilage. Livestock receives extra bedding. Fences are repaired before frost sets in. The family holds a harvest dinner to celebrate the year's accomplishments. Stories from the season are shared. The day a storm chased them out of the field. The night a calf was born in the rain. The morning the yield monitor showed a record-breaking number. They reflect on lessons learned, noting which practices improved soil health, which crop varieties performed well, and which decisions to adjust next year. They take pride in the fact that once again, the farm provided sustenance and purpose. A year on the farm is not just a sequence of tasks, it is a cycle of hope, labor, and renewal that has repeated for 4 generations. The narrative of the farm would be incomplete without acknowledging the women whose labor, wisdom, and leadership have been as essential as any seed planted or cow milked. From the first generation onward, women on the farm were partners in every sense. They tended gardens and livestock, prepared meals for hungry crews, mended clothes, and nurtured children. They kept meticulous records of household expenses and farm accounts, balancing books while rocking infants. They sewed curtains for windows and stitched quilts that warmed family members through bitter winters. They nursed sick animals and children alike, drawing on home remedies passed down through their own mothers. These roles were not confined to the domestic sphere. They extended into the management of the farm. In the early years, when the first generation's wife helped her husband plant corn, she walked behind the plow, dropping kernels into furrows and covering them with a swift kick. She rose before dawn to bake bread and stayed up late to mend harnesses. She taught her children arithmetic by counting eggs and measuring flour. her contributions were woven into the fabric of the farm's success. As decades passed, the roles of women evolved, but their significance never diminished. The second generation's daughters drove teams of horses, milked cows, and butchered chickens. During World War II, when men enlisted, women shouldered additional workloads. They climbed into tractor seats, planted fields, and harvested crops. They learned to weld and repair machinery. They attended agricultural meetings and advocated for policies that supported rural families. They sent packages overseas to husbands and brothers while maintaining the farm and raising children. Their resilience ensured that the farm not only survived, but continued to thrive during uncertain times. By the third generation, many women pursued formal education in agriculture, home economics, and business. They brought new knowledge to the farm. One daughter majored in agronomy, returning with expertise in soil science. She introduced methods for sampling soil and interpreting data to tailor fertilizer applications. Another studied accounting and modernized the farm's finances, implementing budgeting and forecasting tools. She used spreadsheets to plan cash flow and negotiate loans. A third became a nurse and used her medical knowledge to improve calf health protocols, reducing mortality during calving season. Their education complemented the experiential wisdom of previous generations, creating a synergy that strengthened the farm. In addition to their professional contributions, they continued to nurture families, organize community events, and lead 4-H clubs. They navigated the delicate balance between embracing opportunities beyond the farm and honoring responsibilities at home. Many worked off-farm jobs to provide additional income, carrying the farm through lean years. The fourth generation saw women take leadership roles in both the field and the boardroom. Daughters and sons worked side by side, driving tractors, operating combines, and making decisions about crop rotation and marketing. Women led negotiations with buyers and suppliers. They represented the farm at industry conferences, sharing experiences with other farmers and advocating for sustainable practices. They used social media platforms to connect with consumers, explaining farming practices and addressing concerns about animal welfare and environmental impact. They managed direct-to-consumer sales, coordinating orders, deliveries, and customer relations. They designed the farm's website, wrote blog posts, and took photographs that captured the beauty and realities of rural life. They engaged in policy advocacy, traveling to the state capitol to testify on bills affecting agriculture. They ran for positions on cooperative boards and were elected, bringing voices often absent from decision-making tables. Their leadership demonstrated that competence on the farm transcends gender and that diversity strengthens operations. Women on the farm also fostered community resilience. They organized meal trains for neighbors in crisis, coordinated church potlucks, and volunteered at local schools. They taught Sunday school and led youth groups. They served on school boards and community foundations, ensuring that rural voices were represented. They initiated community projects like community gardens and farmers' markets. They collaborated with extension agents to host workshops on canning, nutrition, and garden planning. They were mentors to younger women entering farming, offering guidance and support. They challenged stereotypes that relegated women to certain roles. Through their words and deeds, they inspired daughters to see themselves as future farmers, scientists, and leaders. The contributions of women also extended to cultural preservation. They recorded family histories, took photographs, and kept diaries that documented daily life. These written records provided insight into the joys and struggles of farming through times of change. They passed down recipes that connected food to memory, such as pies made from the first apples of the season or pickles from cucumbers grown in the backyard. They preserved traditions like quilting bees and barn dances, which strengthened bonds among families. Their storytelling kept ancestors alive in the minds of children who had never met them. They taught songs and prayers that had soothed the first generation through hardship. They were the keepers of intangible heritage, ensuring that the farm remained a place where culture thrived as much as crops. In recent years, women on the farm have been instrumental in adopting regenerative practices. They led the initiative to plant pollinator strips, understanding their ecological importance. They spearheaded the installation of rain gardens to capture runoff and recharge groundwater. They introduced rotational grazing plans that improved pasture health. They applied for grants and wrote business plans for new ventures like goat dairy products or farm-to-table dinners. They managed certification processes for organic crops, ensuring compliance with rigorous standards. They monitored soil health metrics and kept meticulous records required for carbon market participation. Their attention to detail and commitment to holistic management were vital as the farm navigated new territories. Acknowledging the contributions of women is not merely an exercise in fairness. It is an honest recognition of the full scope of labor and leadership that has sustained the farm. Without the hands that sewed quilts, the minds that managed budgets, the hearts that nurtured children, and the voices that advocated for change, the farm would not exist as it does today. The story of the farm is as much about their courage and creativity as it is about crop yields and machinery. Community has always been the soil in which the farm's roots have thrived. From the earliest days, when neighbors gathered for barn raisings, to modern collaborations on conservation projects, the farm has never existed in isolation. The first generation arrived to an unsettled landscape, but soon found themselves part of a community that relied on each other for survival. When a neighbor fell ill, others harvested his crops. When a barn burned, everyone arrived with hammers and saws to rebuild. When drought threatened, water from deeper wells was shared. These acts were not charity, but reciprocity, grounded in the understanding that one day each family would need help. The sense of interdependence created strong bonds that endured. Church services were held in schoolhouses, with families rotating roles, leading worship and offering hospitality. Quilting bees and husking parties provided opportunities for socializing and collective labor. These gatherings fed not just bodies, but souls, reinforcing values and identity. As the farm and the surrounding community grew, institutions emerged that further solidified connections. The family joined a cooperative that allowed farmers to pool resources to purchase inputs and market products. The cooperative was governed democratically, giving each member a voice. It provided access to credit, bulk feed and seed, reducing costs and increasing bargaining power. The family's participation in the cooperative taught them about leadership, negotiation, and compromise. They served on the board, helping to make decisions that balanced individual needs with collective benefit. Cooperative meetings became places for exchanging information about markets, weather, and new techniques. They were also social events, with potluck dinners and games for children. The local school was another center of community life. Although the first generations attended one-room schoolhouses, subsequent generations built larger schools that consolidated students from multiple farms. School board elections were contested, reflecting the importance of education to rural families. The family supported the construction of gymnasiums and libraries. They coached sports teams, drove buses, and volunteered in classrooms. The school served as a cultural hub, hosting plays, concerts, and agricultural fairs. It was a place where children from different backgrounds learned together and where community identities were forged. When budgets were tight, the farm donated produce for lunches and fundraisers. The family knew that a strong school system kept families in the area and encouraged young people to return after college. Faith communities provided spiritual and social support. The farm family attended church each Sunday, participating in services, Bible studies, and mission projects. The church choir practiced in their living room. They supported missionaries and organized food drives. Church potlucks were legendary, with tables, groaning under the weight of homemade dishes. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals were hosted in the church, but often celebrated or mourned back at the farm, where food, stories, and prayers were shared under the same roof that had seen generations come and go. The church also served as a platform for civic action. Members organized voter registration drives, supported local candidates, and advocated for legislation on issues such as rural health care and school funding. Family members also took active roles in local governance. They served on township boards, planning commissions, and volunteer emergency services to advocate for road maintenance, rural broadband, farm safety, and other priorities, ensuring that rural perspectives were represented in public decisions. Harvest seasons brought migrant and seasonal workers to the farm. The family provided fair wages and housing, embraced cultural exchange over shared meals, and advocated for policies that respected these workers' dignity and contributions. Community resilience was tested by crises. During the farm crisis of the 1980s, some neighbors lost their farms. The family attended auctions where everything from tractors to kitchen utensils was sold. They bought items not because they needed them, but to provide financial relief. They invited displaced families to share meals, offered temporary housing, and helped them find new opportunities. When floods or tornadoes hit, the farm became a staging area for relief efforts. They stored donated supplies, organized distribution, and hosted volunteers. These acts reaffirmed that in rural areas, community was not optional, it was essential. In recent years, the farm's role in the community has evolved to include education and tourism. They host field days for local farmers to learn about regenerative practices. They invite urban residents to farm dinners, where chefs prepare meals using farm products and discuss the journey from field to plate. They partner with schools for farm-to-school programs, providing fresh produce and teaching students about nutrition and agriculture. They collaborate with local artisans to host craft fairs in the barn, showcasing handmade goods and local foods. They participate in farmers' markets, where they meet consumers face-to-face, answer questions, and build relationships. They welcome university researchers to conduct on-site experiments, contributing to scientific knowledge while also gaining access to cutting-edge techniques. Advocacy complements their hands-on engagement. Through letters, meetings, and public events, the family champions small farms, soil and water conservation, rural infrastructure, healthcare access, and sustainable practices, using their voice to influence positive change. The community, in turn, supports the farm. Local businesses offer credit and sponsorships. Neighbors show up to help during emergencies. Teachers invite family members to speak in classrooms. Churches pray for rain when drought looms. Farmers market customers recommend the farm to friends. Children who once visited on school trips return as adults to buy meat and eggs. Community support is not just sentimental, it is part of the farm's business model. Loyal customers enable direct-to-consumer sales. Local banks provide flexible loans. Cooperative members trust the family's leadership. The mutual reinforcement between the farm and the community has been a constant across generations. It ensures that both thrive. Physical spaces on the farm tell a story as vividly as any photograph or diary entry. Each building, fence, and field bears the marks of time and use, documenting the evolution of agriculture and the family itself. The first structure erected by the original generation was a modest farmhouse of hewn logs and rough boards. It had a dirt floor and a single room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and living area. A lean-to shelter housed livestock. Over the years, as crops succeeded and children arrived, additions were built. A second room, then a porch, then a proper foundation. The farmhouse grew with the family, its sagging beams and uneven floors a testament to improvisation and perseverance. Eventually, the old house was replaced by a modern structure with insulation and electricity, but the original site remained sacred. A lilac bush planted by the first farmer's wife still blooms each spring, filling the air with fragrance and reminding subsequent generations of humble beginnings. The barn has undergone transformations, reflecting changes in livestock and technology. The original barn was built with hand-hewn beams and wooden pegs. Its hayloft stored loose hay that was pitched down to feed animals below. Stalls housed horses, cows, and pigs. Windows were small, and ventilation came through gaps between boards. In the early 20th century, as dairy production became more regulated, the family remodeled the barn to include stanchions and a milking parlor. In the 1960s, they poured concrete floors, installed pipeline milking systems, and added a bulk tank for cooling milk. When the dairy operation was discontinued decades later, the barn was repurposed. Stalls were removed to create space for sheep during lambing season and goats during kidding. The hayloft now hosts barn dances and community gatherings. The barn has been painted red and white, its weather vane replaced, and its doors widened to accommodate modern equipment. Yet original beams still support its roof, and sunlight still filters through hayloft slats. The evolution of equipment sheds mirrors the progression from horse-drawn implements to high-tech machinery. Early sheds housed plows, harrows, and binders. As tractors replaced horses, the family built larger sheds with reinforced concrete floors to support the weight of combines and grain carts. The installation of electricity allowed for power tools and welders. The fourth generation converted part of the shed into a workshop, complete with lifts for repairing vehicles and electronic diagnostic equipment. Solar panels now line the roof, powering tools and charging equipment. The computer used to monitor precision agriculture. Data sits on a workbench next to a grease gun, a modern juxtaposition that captures the melding of technology and tradition. The granary has evolved from wooden cribs to steel bins. Early generations stored corn in wooden cribs with slatted walls that allowed air to circulate. These cribs were filled by hand or with the help of elevators. As production increased, the family invested in steel bins with aeration fans and dryers. They installed sensors to monitor temperature and moisture. They built a grain leg and conveyor system to move grain efficiently. These bins stand like sentinels on the horizon, reflecting sunlight and offering capacity that early farmers could not have imagined. They have become symbols of security, representing the ability to store crops until markets are favorable. However, they also require vigilance. The family holds training sessions on grain bin safety, knowing that accidents can happen if proper procedures are not followed. Fencing and water infrastructure evolved alongside the farm itself. Split rail and barbed wire boundaries gave way to woven and electric fences, with portable systems enabling rotational grazing and reflecting changing livestock management and conservation. Water sources progressed from hand-dug wells and windmills to deep wells, ponds, underground pipes, and rainwater catchment systems, ensuring reliable hydration across pastures even as climate patterns shift. Storage and processing structures have shifted with time. The smokehouse became a tool shed, the root cellar still stores produce, and both the chicken coop and hog barn have been repurposed for changing needs. The machine shop blends antique wrenches with modern parts, turning the farmstead into a living museum. The landscape itself bears marks of intentional design and natural evolution. Contour terraces follow the curves of hills, preventing erosion. Grass waterways cut through crop fields, channeling runoff and reducing gully formation. Shelter belts planted in the 1930s still stand, though some trees have been replaced by younger ones. Wildflower strips border fields, attracting pollinators and beneficial insects. Gravel driveways have been widened and paved. A windbreak near the house once sheltered it from prairie winds when it stood alone. Now, It serves as a backdrop for family photographs. This interplay between built and natural environments illustrates the family's long-term vision. Each generation added or modified structures not for immediate gain, but to serve those who would come after. Through the evolution of physical spaces, the farm tells a story of adaptation. Buildings were modified to meet changing needs. They were also preserved out of respect for heritage. The original farmhouse may be gone, but a stone from its foundation sits by the entrance of the current house, reminding everyone of where they started. The old barn stands alongside modern sheds, bridging past and present. Grain bins cast shadows over fields that once were planted with horse-drawn plows. Fences and hedgerows whisper the boundaries of decisions made decades ago. These physical markers serve as anchors, connecting current generations to the physical labor and visionary planning of their ancestors. They remind the family that they are part of an ongoing narrative written not just in words, but in wood, iron, and earth. If this story resonated with you, share a moment when you had to find courage to stand firm or adapt in the comments below. The world changes when people refuse to stay silent about what matters. Subscribe if you believe that every voice deserves to be heard, especially those that speak quietly from fields and barns. Sometimes being right is not about credentials or experience. Sometimes it is about paying attention when everyone else has stopped. By sharing these stories, we honor the past and inspire the future, proving that the values of faith, family, perseverance, and honest labor remain timeless.